Banned from this cruise ship for exposing corruption. 24 hours later, I walked back on as captain and their faces told me everything. The cruise director's face went pale when she saw me walking up the gangway in full captain's uniform. 24 hours earlier, I'd been banned from this very ship for standing up to their corrupt practices. Now I was back as their new commanding officer, and the look of absolute terror in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about how deep this conspiracy really went. But before I tell you how I went from banned passenger to ship captain in less than a day, let me ask you this. Have you ever been so wronged by someone that you couldn't sleep at night thinking about justice? Have you ever watched corrupt people get away with treating others like garbage while you stood there powerless to stop it? Well, what I'm about to share with you proves that sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and karma doesn't just knock on your door, it kicks it down wearing steel-toed boots. My name is Captain Marcus Webb, and I've been sailing professionally for 37 years. What happened on the Oceanic Paradise wasn't just about one man's revenge. It was about exposing a system so corrupt that passengers were being scammed out of thousands of dollars while crew members lived in fear of speaking out. The story I'm about to tell you involves fraud, intimidation, and a conspiracy that reached all the way to the corporate boardroom. In this video, I'm going to reveal exactly how I uncovered the biggest cruise line scandal in maritime history. You'll learn the shocking truth about what really happens behind the scenes on luxury cruise ships. I'll show you the evidence that brought down an entire network of corrupt officials. And yes, I'll explain exactly how I went from persona non grata to the man holding the captain's keys in 24 hours. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. Not only did I expose their criminal enterprise, I did it while sailing their own ship. The very vessel they banned me from became the platform for their complete destruction. And the best part? They paid me handsomely to do it. Now, I need to warn you up front. What you're about to hear involves some of the most unethical behavior I've witnessed in 4 decades at sea. There are recordings, documents, and testimonies that will make your blood boil. But stick with me, because the ending is so satisfying it'll restore your faith in justice. The Oceanic Paradise was supposed to be my retirement cruise. After 37 years commanding cargo ships, oil tankers, and research vessels, I'd finally booked a luxury cabin on what was advertised as the most exclusive cruise experience in the Mediterranean. 7 days of 5-star dining, premium entertainment, and relaxation before I officially hung up my captain's hat for good. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped aboard. The crew looked nervous, jumpy, like they were walking on eggshells around the ship's management. Passengers were complaining about hidden fees, canceled excursions, and mysterious charges appearing on their room bills. But what really caught my attention was overhearing a conversation between 2 junior officers near the engine room. They were talking about falsified safety reports, deliberately understaffed emergency stations, and something called the Premium Passenger Protection Racket. Now, as someone who'd spent decades ensuring maritime safety, those words made my captain's instincts kick into overdrive. I started paying attention to details that other passengers might miss. The safety drill was a joke. Half the crew members assigned to muster stations weren't even present. The life jackets in several cabins were expired or damaged. Emergency exits were blocked by furniture that had been moved to create more dining space. This wasn't just poor management. This was criminal negligence that put every soul on that ship at risk. But the real revelation came on day 3, when I witnessed what they were doing to elderly passengers in the casino. Margaret Henderson, a 78-year-old widow from Ohio, had been systematically manipulated into gambling away her entire cruise budget, plus an additional $8,000 in cash advances. The casino staff were using psychological pressure tactics that would make Las Vegas loan sharks blush. When Margaret broke down crying at the blackjack table, begging them to stop her from gambling, the pit boss just laughed and offered her another complimentary drink. That's when I stepped in. As a ship's captain, even retired, I recognized my moral obligation to protect vulnerable passengers from predatory behavior. I helped Margaret back to her cabin and started documenting what I'd witnessed. Credit card receipts, timestamps, even recorded conversations on my phone. What I discovered was a sophisticated operation designed to extract maximum profit from passengers through fraudulent charges, rigged games, and deliberately misleading contract terms. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Captain Rodriguez, the ship's commanding officer. Professional courtesy, one captain to another. I presented my evidence calmly, respectfully, expecting him to take immediate action to protect his passengers and crew. Instead, he looked at my documentation like I'd just handed him a live grenade. His response was not what I expected from a fellow maritime professional. He became defensive, then aggressive, claiming I was interfering with legitimate business operations. When I mentioned the safety violations I'd observed, his face went red with anger. He accused me of being a troublemaker, a disgruntled passenger looking for a free cruise by manufacturing complaints. But it was his next statement that told me everything I needed to know about how deep this corruption really went. He said, and I quote, "Captain Webb, you need to understand that this ship operates under different rules than whatever cargo haulers you're used to commanding. We have investors to satisfy and quotas to meet. If you can't accept that, maybe this cruise isn't for you. Different rules. Quotas to meet." This wasn't about hospitality or passenger satisfaction. This was about systematic exploitation, and Captain Rodriguez was either complicit or completely controlled by whoever was really running this operation. I spent the next 2 hours in my cabin, reviewing everything I'd documented. The pattern was clear. They were targeting vulnerable passengers with sophisticated scams while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate cruise operation. The safety violations weren't accidental oversights. They were calculated cost-cutting measures that increased profit margins while putting lives at risk. That evening, I approached 3 other passengers who'd been victims of suspicious charges and questionable practices. Robert Chen, a retired accountant, had been charged $1,500 for a wine tasting that never happened. Linda Martinez discovered that her shore excursion fees had been doubled without notification. David Park found unauthorized spa charges on his bill totaling over $2,000. Together, we started building a comprehensive case, not just individual complaints, but a documented pattern of systematic fraud affecting multiple passengers across different departments of the ship. We had receipts, witness statements, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence of safety violations. By midnight, our informal investigation had uncovered something much bigger than isolated incidents of passenger mistreatment. We'd stumbled onto evidence of what appeared to be an organized criminal enterprise operating under the cover of luxury hospitality. The next morning, everything changed. I woke up to find a formal notice slipped under my cabin door. Effective immediately, I was banned from all public areas of the ship for disruptive behavior and interference with crew operations. Security would escort me to my cabin after each meal, and I was prohibited from communicating with other passengers about ship operations. But here's where their plan backfired spectacularly. See, they assumed I was just another complaining passenger who could be silenced through intimidation. They had no idea who they were really dealing with, because what Captain Rodriguez didn't know was that I hadn't retired from maritime service. I'd actually accepted a new position as Regional Safety Inspector for the International Maritime Organization. And the Oceanic Paradise? Well, it had been scheduled for a surprise safety audit that very week, an audit that I was supposed to conduct under my new authority. The cruise line had been notified that an IMO inspector would be boarding their vessel, but they didn't know it was me. They thought Marcus Webb the passenger and Marcus Webb the inspector were 2 different people. So while they were congratulating themselves on silencing a troublesome passenger, they had no idea they'd just declared war on the very man who held the power to shut down their entire operation. The irony was so perfect, it felt like destiny intervening on behalf of every passenger who'd ever been victimized by their corrupt system. That afternoon, while confined to my cabin, I made a series of very interesting phone calls, first to my supervisor at the IMO, then to the Coast Guard, and finally to a contact at the FBI who specialized in maritime fraud cases. By evening, a coordinated investigation was already in motion, but the real surprise was still coming. Because 24 hours later, when Captain Rodriguez received an urgent message from corporate headquarters, he discovered that the Oceanic Paradise had a new commanding officer. Someone with the authority to conduct a complete audit of ship operations, interview crew members, and examine all financial records. The message was simple. Effective immediately, Captain Marcus Webb would be assuming temporary command of the vessel to conduct emergency safety and operational compliance reviews. Captain Rodriguez was to surrender all command authority and cooperate fully with the investigation. The look on his face when I walked onto the bridge wearing my new captain's uniform was worth every moment of humiliation I'd endured the day before. His mouth actually fell open as the reality hit him. The troublesome passenger he'd tried to silence was now his commanding officer with full authority over the ship and everyone on it. That's when I smiled and said the words I'd been rehearsing all morning. Captain Rodriguez, you're relieved of duty pending investigation into multiple violations of maritime law and international passenger protection regulations. Please report to your cabin and remain available for questioning. The next few hours would reveal corruption so extensive it would make international headlines and result in criminal charges against 17 people. But standing there on that bridge, watching the man who'd tried to silence me realize his career was over, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, undiluted justice. The first thing I did as acting captain was order an immediate all-hands meeting in the main theater. Every crew member, every department head, every supervisor who'd been part of this corrupt system was required to attend. No exceptions. And let me tell you, watching them file into that room, seeing the panic in their eyes as they realized their world had just turned upside down, was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. I stood at the podium where just days earlier they'd held their fake safety briefing, and I could feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. These people had gotten comfortable operating outside the law, confident that their victims were just passengers who'd be gone in a week with no real power to fight back. Now they were face to face with someone who could end their careers with a single report. But here's what they didn't expect. Instead of immediately announcing investigations and arrests, I started with a simple question that cut right to the heart of their operation. How many of you became cruise ship employees because you wanted to help people have the vacation of their dreams? About half the room raised their hands, confused but hopeful that maybe this wasn't going to be as bad as they feared. The other half sat stone-faced, already calculating their exit strategies. That division told me everything I needed to know about who was complicit and who was just following orders out of fear. Good, I continued, because that's exactly what we're going to do. Starting right now, this ship is going to operate the way it should have been operating all along, with integrity, safety, and genuine care for every passenger on board. Then I dropped the bomb that sent shockwaves through their entire criminal network. But first, we're going to correct some mistakes. Every fraudulent charge, every rigged game, every hidden fee that's been extracted from passengers over the past 6 months is going to be refunded, with interest. And anyone who's been intimidated into silence about safety violations or illegal practices now has full protection to come forward without fear of retaliation. The silence that followed was deafening. I could literally see people's faces changing as they processed what this meant for their carefully constructed house of cards. Some looked relieved, finally free to speak the truth they'd been forced to hide. Others looked terrified, realizing their participation in fraud was about to be exposed. Maria Santos, a housekeeping supervisor, was the first to raise her hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was steel underneath the fear. Captain Webb, we've been told to report any passenger complaints about missing items or suspicious charges as theft accusations against crew members. They said it would protect the ship's reputation. Go on, I encouraged, and suddenly the floodgates opened. James Mitchell from Guest Services revealed how they'd been instructed to process credit card charges for services that didn't exist, then blame computer glitches if passengers complained. Sarah Kim from the casino explained the psychological manipulation tactics they'd been trained to use on elderly passengers, including deliberately serving alcohol to impair judgment during high-stakes gambling. But the testimony that really made my blood boil came from Dr. Patricia Vance, the ship's medical officer. She'd been ordered to minimize injury reports and avoid documenting safety incidents that might trigger regulatory scrutiny. Passengers with serious medical conditions were being cleared for activities that put them at risk, all to avoid liability issues that might impact the company's insurance rates. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of systematic criminal activity that went far beyond simple passenger mistreatment. This was organized fraud, endangerment, and conspiracy on a massive scale, and every single piece of evidence was being recorded for the investigation that would follow. By the end of that meeting, I had 17 crew members willing to testify about illegal activities they'd witnessed or been forced to participate in. More importantly, I had a complete organizational chart of who was giving orders, who was following them, and who was profiting from this criminal enterprise. That's when I made the announcement that would change everything for the passengers who'd been victimized by this corrupt system. Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, this ship is under new management. Every fraudulent charge will be reversed. Every rigged game will be shut down. Every safety violation will be corrected. And anyone who's been harmed by the previous operations will receive full compensation plus damages. The applause that erupted from the crew members who'd been forced to participate in these schemes was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just relief. It was the sound of people getting their integrity back after months or years of being forced to compromise their values just to keep their jobs. But the real work was just beginning. Because exposing the corruption was only half the battle. Now I had to prove that a cruise ship could operate profitably while treating passengers and crew with basic human decency. And I had exactly 5 days to make that happen before we reached port. And the corporate executives who'd enabled this system realized what was happening. The first order of business was passenger restitution. Using the ship's own financial records, my team calculated that over $400,000 in fraudulent charges had been extracted from passengers over the previous 6 months. Money that had gone directly into bonus payments for management and inflated profit reports to corporate headquarters. Margaret Henderson, the elderly widow I'd first tried to help, was owed $12,000 in gambling losses that had been obtained through predatory practices. Robert Chen got back the $1,500 for his phantom wine tasting, plus an additional $500 in damages for the stress and embarrassment he'd endured. One by one, every passenger who'd been victimized received full compensation. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Word spread quickly through the passenger community about what was happening. Instead of being angry about the previous treatment, people were amazed by the transparency and immediate action to make things right. The ship's satisfaction ratings, which had been hovering around 40%, jumped to 96% overnight. Passengers who'd been planning to demand refunds and file lawsuits suddenly became the ship's biggest advocates. They started posting on social media about the incredible turnaround, the honest treatment, the genuine care they were receiving. What had been shaping up as a public relations nightmare became a viral success story about corporate accountability and doing the right thing. The casino, instead of being a predatory operation designed to separate vulnerable people from their money, became a legitimate entertainment venue with clearly posted odds, responsible gaming policies, and trained staff who actively helped people gamble responsibly. Revenue actually increased because passengers felt comfortable playing when they knew the games were fair. The dining experiences improved dramatically once the hidden fees and upcharge scams were eliminated. Passengers could actually enjoy their meals without worrying about surprise charges appearing on their bills. The spa stopped pushing expensive treatments through high-pressure sales tactics and focused on providing genuine relaxation experiences. Most importantly, the safety protocols were completely overhauled. Emergency stations were properly staffed. Life jackets were inspected and replaced where necessary. Crew members received additional training on emergency procedures. The ship actually became safer while operating more efficiently. But the victory I was most proud of came from the crew themselves. Without the pressure to participate in fraudulent schemes, they could focus on what they'd originally signed up for, helping people have incredible vacation experiences. Morale improved so dramatically that productivity increased across every department. By day 4 of my command, something remarkable had happened. The Oceanic Paradise had become the cruise ship it was always supposed to be: profitable, ethical, safe, and genuinely focused on passenger satisfaction. We'd proven that treating people with respect and honesty wasn't just the right thing to do, it was also better business. That's when I received the phone call that would determine whether this transformation could become permanent or if we'd just won a temporary battle in a much larger war. Corporate headquarters had finally figured out what was happening, and they were not pleased about their carefully orchestrated profit scheme being dismantled by someone they'd never authorized to take command. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, threatening, and absolutely convinced that I'd exceeded my authority in ways that would result in criminal charges against me. They were demanding I restore the previous operations immediately and prepare to face serious legal consequences for interfering with their business model. That's when I smiled and delivered the news that would end their criminal enterprise forever. "Sir," I said, savoring every word, "I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't Marcus Webb, the passenger calling. This is Captain Marcus Webb, Senior Maritime Inspector for the International Maritime Organization, conducting an official investigation into multiple violations of international maritime law." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ocean waves through my cabin window. When the voice finally returned, it had lost all its arrogance and authority. The man on the other end was no longer threatening a troublesome passenger. He was facing a federal investigator with the power to shut down their entire operation. "Ida. Inspector Webb, we weren't informed that you were conducting an audit of the Oceanic Paradise. Our records show a passenger complaint, not an official investigation." "That's correct," I replied, settling back in my captain's chair. "Your records show Marcus Webb, retired merchant marine captain, booked passage on your vessel. What your records don't show is that Marcus Webb, IMO senior inspector, was scheduled to conduct a surprise compliance audit during that exact sailing. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you agree?" I could practically hear his brain trying to calculate the legal implications of what they'd done. They'd banned a federal maritime inspector from their ship for documenting safety violations and passenger fraud. They'd tried to silence the very person whose job it was to investigate exactly the kind of criminal activity he'd witnessed. "Inspector Webb, surely we can discuss this situation. There may have been some miscommunications, some procedural errors that can be corrected without involving regulatory authorities." "Oh, but I am the regulatory authority," I said, allowing myself a small laugh. "And this conversation is being recorded as part of my official investigation. Would you like to continue making statements about correcting procedural errors, or would you prefer to exercise your right to legal counsel?" The panic in his voice was unmistakable now. What exactly are you investigating?" I opened the thick folder of evidence I'd compiled over the past 4 days. Bank records, passenger statements, crew testimonies, safety violation documentation, recorded conversations, enough evidence to support criminal charges against 17 individuals and civil penalties that would bankrupt their cruise line. "Let's start with systematic fraud targeting vulnerable passengers, shall we? Then we'll move on to falsified safety reports, deliberate understaffing of emergency stations, and intimidation of crew members who attempted to report illegal activities. Should I continue, or would you like to hear about the money laundering operation you've been running through your casino?" The phone went dead silent again. I could imagine him frantically calculating damage control strategies, wondering how much evidence I actually had, trying to figure out if there was any way to minimize the catastrophe that was about to destroy everything they'd built. Gaso. "Inspector Webb, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. We run a legitimate cruise operation. Any irregularities you may have observed can certainly be explained and corrected immediately." "Irregularities?" I pulled out Margaret Henderson's casino receipts, the ones showing $12,000 in charges accumulated over a 6-hour period while she was being systematically manipulated by your trained staff. "Is that what you call predatory gambling practices designed to extract maximum money from elderly passengers with cognitive vulnerabilities?" "Sir, our casino operates within all applicable gaming regulations." "Your casino operates as a criminal enterprise," I interrupted. "I have recorded conversations of your pit bosses discussing psychological manipulation techniques. I have testimony from dealers who were instructed to continue serving alcohol to impaired players. I have medical records showing that Mrs. Henderson was suffering from early-stage dementia, which your staff exploited to maximize her losses." The evidence was overwhelming, and we both knew it, but what he didn't know yet was how far this investigation had already progressed beyond our ship. While I'd been documenting crimes on the oceanic paradise, federal investigators had been examining the cruise line's other vessels, their corporate headquarters, and their financial records. Inspector Webb, what would it take to resolve this situation quietly? We're prepared to make significant changes to our operations, provide compensation to affected passengers, and implement whatever safety protocols you recommend. This was the moment I'd been building toward since that first morning when Captain Rodriguez had dismissed my concerns as the complaints of a disgruntled passenger. The moment when the people who thought they were untouchable realized they were facing someone with the power to hold them accountable. Sir, what it would take is impossible because you can't unbribe officials, you can't unfraud passengers, and you can't unfalsify the safety reports that put lives at risk. This isn't a negotiation. This is a criminal investigation, and you've just confessed to multiple federal crimes on a recorded line. You can't prove any of this holds up in court. Actually, I can. I pulled out my laptop and opened the file that would end this conversation permanently. Because while you've been running your criminal enterprise, I've been building a federal case. FBI Financial Crimes Division has been monitoring your bank accounts for 3 months. Coast Guard investigators have been interviewing former crew members who were fired for reporting safety violations. And the Department of Justice has been preparing criminal charges against everyone involved in this conspiracy. The sound of papers rustling came through the phone as he apparently knocked over something on his desk. This is impossible. You're just one inspector. You can't have organized a multi-agency investigation in 5 days. You're absolutely right, I said, enjoying this more than I probably should have. I couldn't organize a multi-agency investigation in 5 days, but I could complete one that's been running for 6 months. See, the IMO has been receiving complaints about systematic fraud and safety violations across your entire fleet. My assignment to audit the oceanic paradise wasn't coincidence. It was the final piece of evidence needed to support criminal charges. This is entrapment. You booked passage under false pretenses. I booked passage under my legal name and paid full price for my cabin. The fact that you didn't recognize that your passenger and your inspector were the same person isn't entrapment. It's incompetence. The conversation was essentially over, but I had one more revelation that would drive home just how completely their world had collapsed. Oh, and one more thing. That urgent message you received from corporate headquarters ordering you to surrender command to me? That didn't come from your executives. That came from a federal judge who signed a court order seizing operational control of your vessel pending criminal investigation. The phone clattered as he apparently dropped it. When his voice came back, it was barely a whisper. You're not just conducting an audit. You're executing a federal seizure. Congratulations, I said. You finally understand your situation. Over the next 2 hours, I received 17 more phone calls from various executives, lawyers, and corporate officers, each more desperate than the last. They offered bribes, threatened lawsuits, claimed diplomatic immunity, and tried every legal and illegal tactic they could think of to stop what was happening. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, the investigation was complete, and the criminal charges were already being filed in federal court. More importantly, the passengers who'd been victimized were finally getting justice, and the crew members who'd been forced to participate in illegal activities were free to do their jobs with integrity. The most satisfying call came from Margaret Henderson's daughter, who'd flown to meet the ship at our next port. Through tears of gratitude, she thanked me for not only recovering her mother's money, but for treating her with the dignity and respect she deserved. That conversation reminded me why I'd become a ship's captain in the first place, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But the story wasn't over yet. Because while I'd won the battle for the oceanic paradise, the war against cruise line corruption was just beginning. Federal investigators had identified similar operations on 12 other ships, affecting thousands of passengers and involving millions of dollars in fraudulent charges. The evidence we'd gathered on the oceanic paradise became the template for investigating the entire industry. Safety protocols that had been ignored for years were suddenly being enforced. Financial practices that had victimized vulnerable passengers were being prosecuted as federal crimes. Crew members who'd been silenced by intimidation were finally able to report illegal activities without fear of retaliation. 3 months later, the oceanic paradise sailed into port under my command for the final time. The criminal trials were beginning, The passenger restitution program was fully operational, and the cruise line's assets were being liquidated to pay damages to the thousands of people who'd been victimized by their systematic fraud. As I walked down the gangway, I passed new passengers boarding for what would be the ship's first sailing under completely honest management. The new crew looked nervous but excited, eager to prove that cruise ships could operate profitably while treating people with basic human decency. Margaret Henderson was waiting at the bottom of the gangway, with a thank you card signed by 43 passengers who'd been helped by our investigation. But more than the gratitude, what struck me was the confidence in her eyes. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor who'd seen justice served and dignity restored. That evening, as I packed my captain's uniform for what I thought might be the last time, I realized something profound had happened over those 5 days. I hadn't just exposed corruption or recovered stolen money or improved safety protocols. I'd proven that individual action could still matter in a world that often seemed controlled by systems too big and too powerful to challenge. The next morning, I received a phone call that would change everything once again. Captain Webb, this is Admiral Patricia Morrison from the International Maritime Organization headquarters in London. I hope you're planning to stick around, because we have a proposition that might interest you. I set down my coffee and walked to the window of my hotel room overlooking the harbor where the Oceanic Paradise sat docked, now flying new colors under legitimate management. Admiral Morrison, I'm listening. What you accomplished on the Oceanic Paradise has sent shockwaves through the entire cruise industry. But more importantly, it's given us a roadmap for cleaning up maritime fraud on a global scale. We want you to lead a new task force with full authority to investigate and take command of any vessel suspected of systematic passenger exploitation. The offer was tempting, but I'd been in this business long enough to know that real change required more than just individual heroics. Admiral, with respect, one inspector taking command of one ship isn't going to solve an industry-wide problem. These people adapt quickly. They'll just develop new ways to hide their criminal activities. That's exactly why we need you to think bigger, Captain. We're not talking about one ship or even one cruise line. We're talking about a complete overhaul of how maritime passenger protection is enforced internationally. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Captain Webb, the evidence you gathered on the Oceanic Paradise has already resulted in criminal charges against 67 individuals across 14 countries. Your documentation methods have become the new standard for maritime fraud investigation, but we've identified similar operations on over 200 vessels worldwide. 200 vessels. I sat down heavily in my chair, processing the magnitude of what she was describing. If each ship was victimizing passengers at the same rate as the Oceanic Paradise, we were looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in systematic fraud affecting hundreds of thousands of people. What exactly are you proposing, Admiral? Joint task force with Interpol, FBI, and maritime authorities from 36 countries. You'd have the authority to board any passenger vessel in international waters, assume command if necessary, and coordinate criminal investigations across multiple jurisdictions. Full diplomatic immunity, unlimited resources, and legal backing from the highest levels of international law enforcement. I walked back to the window, watching maintenance crews working on the Oceanic Paradise. These were honest workers now, no longer afraid of being fired for refusing to participate in criminal schemes. The transformation had been remarkable, but Admiral Morrison was right. One ship wasn't enough. Admiral, I appreciate the offer, but I need to know this isn't just about high-profile prosecutions and media attention. Are we actually committed to protecting passengers? Or are we just trying to look tough on maritime crime? Her response came without hesitation. Captain Webb, yesterday I received a handwritten letter from an 84-year-old man in Florida who lost his life savings to cruise ship gambling fraud. His granddaughter had to start a fundraising campaign just to pay for his medication. That letter is sitting on my desk right now, and it's exactly why this task force needs to exist. How many people are we talking about helping? Based on the patterns you identified, we estimate over 50,000 passengers have been victimized by systematic fraud in just the past 2 years. Financial losses exceed $400 million. But the real damage goes beyond money, Captain. These are people who saved for years to take dream vacations, only to be treated like prey by an industry that's supposed to provide hospitality and safety. The scope was staggering, but what really convinced me was thinking about Margaret Henderson and the dozens of other passengers I'd met who'd been victimized by these predatory practices. If there were 50,000 more people out there facing the same exploitation, then this task force wasn't just an opportunity, it was a moral obligation. What would be my first assignment? The Mediterranean Star, currently sailing between Barcelona and Rome. We've received reports of safety violations, passenger fraud, and crew intimidation identical to what you found on the Oceanic Paradise. But this one's more complicated, Captain. The ship is flagged in Panama, owned by a shell company in Luxembourg, operated by a management firm in Greece, and staffed by crew from 12 different countries. Complicated how? Multiple jurisdictions means multiple opportunities for evidence to disappear, witnesses to be intimidated, and criminals to escape prosecution. We need someone who can navigate international maritime law while building airtight criminal cases that will hold up in courts across Europe and North America. I thought about the crew members on the Oceanic Paradise who'd risked their careers to testify about the illegal activities they'd witnessed. How many more were out there, forced to participate in criminal schemes just to keep their jobs? How many passengers were being victimized right now while we talked? Admiral, I have one condition. Any crew member who cooperates with our investigation gets full protection from retaliation and guaranteed employment on legitimate vessels. These people shouldn't have to choose between their integrity and their livelihood. Agreed. What else do you need? Complete operational secrecy until I'm actually aboard the target vessel. If these criminal networks get advance warning, evidence disappears and witnesses vanish. The element of surprise is crucial. Already arranged. Your cover identity, documentation, and cabin reservations are being prepared as we speak. You'll board the Mediterranean Star tomorrow evening in Barcelona as Dr. Marcus Webb, retired university professor taking a cultural cruise through the Mediterranean. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once again, I'd be going undercover as a passenger to investigate the very people who were supposed to be serving me. But this time, I'd have the full backing of international law enforcement and the experience of knowing exactly what to look for. One more thing, Admiral. I want regular updates on passenger restitution from our previous investigation. Success isn't just about prosecuting criminals, it's about making victims whole again. Captain Webb, I think you're going to like working with this task force. We've already recovered $12 million in fraudulent charges from accounts linked to the Oceanic Paradise investigation. Every penny is going back to passengers who were victimized. That evening, I found myself packing a very different kind of luggage. Instead of the captain's uniform that had struck fear into corrupt crew members, I was packing the casual clothes of a retired professor. Hidden compartments contained recording equipment, document cameras, and secure communication devices that would allow me to coordinate with law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. But the most important item I packed was a small notebook containing contact information for 43 passengers from the Oceanic Paradise who'd volunteered to serve as witnesses in future investigations. People who'd been victimized but were now committed to ensuring others didn't face the same exploitation. The flight to Barcelona gave me time to study the intelligence files on the Mediterranean Star. The patterns were disturbingly familiar. Elderly passengers targeted for gambling fraud, hidden fees appearing on room bills, safety protocols ignored to increase profit margins, crew members intimidated into silence about illegal activities. What was new was the sophistication of their money laundering operation. Instead of simply pocketing fraudulent charges, they were using a network of shell companies and offshore accounts to hide stolen money across multiple jurisdictions. This wasn't just passenger fraud. It was international organized crime using cruise ships as floating criminal enterprises. The passenger manifest revealed their target demographics clearly. 60% of passengers were over 65, traveling alone or in couples, many on fixed incomes who'd saved for years to afford this vacation. Perfect victims for predatory practices designed to extract maximum money through psychological manipulation and deliberate confusion about charges and fees. But studying the crew roster gave me hope. Unlike the Oceanic Paradise, where management had created a culture of fear and complicity, the Mediterranean Star showed signs of internal resistance. 3 department heads had submitted formal safety complaints that were ignored by ship management. 5 crew members had requested transfers, citing ethical concerns about passenger treatment. These were potential allies, people who wanted to do their jobs with integrity but were trapped in a corrupt system. My experience on the Oceanic Paradise had taught me that most crew members weren't criminals. They were victims themselves, forced to participate in illegal activities or lose their employment. Landing in Barcelona, I took a taxi through the historic city center toward the port where the Mediterranean Star waited. From the outside, she was beautiful. Gleaming white hull, elegant lines, the kind of vessel that promised luxury and adventure. But I knew that beneath the surface glamour, passengers were being systematically victimized by people who viewed them as nothing more than sources of illegal profit. The boarding process itself was revealing. Passengers were rushed through check-in without adequate explanation of policies, fees, or safety procedures. Credit card authorizations were obtained for vague incidental charges that could easily be exploited later. Emergency information was glossed over so quickly that most passengers couldn't possibly understand their obligations or protections. My cabin was identical to the one I'd occupied on the Oceanic Paradise, comfortable but not luxurious, with hidden cameras now documenting everything I observed. The difference was that this time I knew exactly what to look for and had the legal authority to act on whatever evidence I gathered. That first evening at dinner, the patterns became immediately apparent. Waitstaff were pushing expensive wine packages with deliberately misleading information about what was included. The casino was already targeting elderly passengers with promotional offers designed to maximize gambling losses. Shore excursion sales presentations contained false information about included services and hidden fees. But what really caught my attention was a conversation between 2 junior officers near the elevator. They were discussing falsified passenger safety drills and discussing how to avoid documenting incidents that might trigger regulatory scrutiny. The same criminal negligence that had put lives at risk on the Oceanic Paradise was being repeated on another vessel. By the second day, I'd identified the key players in their criminal organization. Maria Santos, the guest services director, was coordinating fraudulent billing practices. James Chen, the casino manager, was running the predatory gambling operation. Captain Alessandro Romano was either complicit in the safety violations or completely controlled by whoever was really managing this criminal enterprise. The breakthrough came when I overheard a heated argument between 2 crew members in the laundry facility. Elena Petrov, a housekeeping supervisor, was refusing to participate in a scheme to plant evidence of theft in passenger cabins, then blame missing items on crew members who'd reported safety violations. This was worse than anything I'd found on the Oceanic Paradise. They weren't just stealing money from passengers. They were framing innocent crew members for theft to silence anyone who might report their criminal activities. The level of systematic corruption was breathtaking. That night, I made contact with Elena using the secure protocols Admiral Morrison had provided. Within hours, I had testimony about forced participation in criminal activities, documentation of intimidation tactics used against crew members, and evidence of a conspiracy that reached into corporate management. But Elena's information revealed something that changed the entire scope of our investigation. The Mediterranean Star wasn't an isolated criminal operation. It was part of a network of 12 vessels using identical fraud techniques, coordinated through a central command structure that moved money and personnel between ships to avoid detection. Dr. Webb, Elena whispered during our clandestine meeting in the ship's library, they rotate management every 6 months so no one can build cases against them. The casino managers, guest services directors, even some of the officers, they move between ships before authorities can investigate complaints. This explained why individual investigations had failed to stop the systematic fraud. By the time authorities gathered evidence on one vessel, the criminals had moved to another ship in a different jurisdiction. It was a sophisticated shell game designed to exploit gaps in international maritime law enforcement. Elena, how many ships are involved in this network? At least 12 that I know of, maybe more. They call it the Mediterranean Circuit, but some ships operate in the Caribbean and Alaska during different seasons. Same criminal techniques, same management rotation, same money laundering operations. The magnitude of the conspiracy was staggering. We weren't just dealing with corruption on individual cruise ships. We were facing an international criminal organization that had infiltrated the entire cruise industry. But Elena's cooperation gave us something previous investigations had lacked, an inside source who understood how the network operated. Over the next 3 days, Elena introduced me to other crew members who'd been forced to participate in illegal activities or face termination. What emerged was a picture of systematic coercion where honest employees were given impossible choices: compromise their integrity or lose their jobs and be blacklisted from maritime employment. The evidence we gathered was overwhelming. Recorded conversations detailing fraud techniques, financial records showing money laundering operations, testimony from dozens of crew members, and photographic documentation of safety violations that put passengers' lives at risk. But the most damning evidence came from Maria Santos herself, who had no idea that her conversations were being recorded by the very professor she'd been trying to scam. Her detailed explanations of psychological manipulation tactics, her casual discussion of targeting vulnerable passengers, her bragging about quarterly profit margins from fraudulent activities. It was all documented with crystal clarity. On the 4th day, everything changed when I received an encrypted message from Admiral Morrison. Federal agents had simultaneously raided the corporate headquarters of 3 cruise lines, seizing financial records that confirmed the existence of the criminal network Elena had described. More importantly, they'd identified the mastermind coordinating the entire operation. Victor Castellanos, a former cruise line executive who'd been quietly building a criminal empire for over a decade. Using his industry connections and knowledge of maritime law loopholes, he'd created a system that could steal millions of dollars from passengers while remaining virtually immune to prosecution. But Castellanos had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that maritime law enforcement agencies couldn't coordinate effectively across international jurisdictions. He'd built his empire on the belief that evidence gathered in international waters couldn't be used in domestic criminal courts. The joint task force Admiral Morrison had assembled proved him wrong. With investigators from 36 countries working together, sharing evidence and coordinating prosecutions, Castellanos' network was about to face justice on a scale they'd never imagined possible. That evening, as the Mediterranean Star sailed toward Rome for what would be its final voyage under criminal management, I prepared for the confrontation that would bring down an entire criminal empire. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal authority was clear, and the element of surprise was complete. Tomorrow morning, I would transform from Dr. Marcus Webb, retired professor, into Captain Marcus Webb, senior maritime inspector with the authority to seize control of any vessel engaged in criminal activities. And this time, I wouldn't just be saving one ship's worth of passengers and crew. This time, I'd be dismantling a criminal network that had victimized thousands of people across multiple continents. The war against cruise ship corruption was about to escalate beyond anything these criminals had ever faced. As I fell asleep that night, listening to the gentle rolling of the Mediterranean Sea, I thought about all the passengers who'd been victimized by this network, all the crew members who'd been forced into criminal complicity, and all the future travelers who would benefit from the justice we were about to deliver. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end for Victor Castellanos and his criminal empire, and I could hardly wait to see the look on Captain Romano's face when he realized his passenger wasn't who he appeared to be. The storm was coming, and this time there would be no escape. The next morning arrived with Mediterranean sunshine streaming through my cabin porthole, but the calm weather was about to be shattered by the storm I was about to unleash. At exactly 9 a.m., while passengers were enjoying their complimentary breakfast and congratulating themselves on another successful night of victim exploitation, I received the encrypted message I'd been waiting for. Authorization confirmed. Execute Operation Clean Sweep immediately. All agencies standing by. I smiled as I put on the same casual professor clothes I'd worn for 4 days, knowing this would be the last time anyone would see Dr. Marcus Webb. By noon, Captain Marcus Webb would be in command of this vessel, and Victor Castellanos' criminal empire would begin its final collapse. The transformation began in the ship's communications center, where I used my emergency override codes to contact the bridge directly. Captain Romano's voice crackled through the intercom, annoyed at being interrupted during his morning routine. Communications center, this is highly irregular. Passengers are not authorized to use ship-to-shore communications without... Captain Romano, this is Senior Maritime Inspector Marcus Webb, International Maritime Organization. You are hereby ordered to report to the bridge immediately and prepare to surrender command of this vessel. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ocean waves through the communication room's porthole. When Romano's voice finally returned, it carried the same panic I'd heard from Captain Rodriguez on the Oceanic Paradise. This is impossible. You're a passenger. I've seen your documentation. Dr. Marcus Webb, retired professor from... Captain Romano, you have exactly 10 minutes to report to the bridge, or I will have you arrested for obstruction of a federal investigation. Every conversation on this ship has been monitored and recorded for the past 4 days. Your choice is cooperation or criminal prosecution. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall in perfect sequence. Within minutes, my secure communication device was buzzing with confirmations from law enforcement agencies across Europe. Spanish authorities had boarded 2 ships in Barcelona. Italian officials were seizing vessels in Naples. French investigators were raiding corporate offices in Marseille. The coordinated strike was happening simultaneously across 12 time zones, targeting every element of Castellanos' network at the same moment. Ships, offices, bank accounts, and safe houses were being secured by hundreds of investigators who'd been planning this operation for months. But the most satisfying moment came when I walked onto the bridge of the Mediterranean Star wearing my inspector's credentials and watched Captain Romano's face cycle through disbelief, terror, and resignation in the span of 30 seconds. Gato. Captain Romano, you are relieved of command pending investigation into systematic passenger fraud, safety violations, and conspiracy to commit maritime crimes. Please step away from all control systems and prepare to provide testimony about your knowledge of illegal activities. His hands trembled as he removed his captain's insignia and set them on the chart table. Behind him, the bridge crew stood frozen, uncertain whether to follow his orders or mine. The moment stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Inspector Webb, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I run a legitimate cruise operation. Any irregularities you may have observed... Captain Romano, stop. I pulled out the thick file of evidence Elena and I had compiled. I have recorded conversations of you discussing falsified safety reports. I have testimony from crew members about intimidation tactics used to silence safety complaints. I have financial records showing your participation in systematic passenger fraud. I opened the file and began reading from his own recorded words. Quote, if passengers complain about charges, blame computer errors and offer them a free drink. Most of them are too embarrassed to pursue it further. End quote. Would you like me to continue, Captain? The color drained from his face as he recognized his own voice, speaking words he'd thought were private conversations with his criminal co-conspirators. The reality was sinking in that every aspect of their operation had been documented and was now evidence in multiple criminal investigations. Inspector Webb, what do you want from me? The truth, Captain. Complete cooperation with our investigation and immediate implementation of legitimate safety and operational procedures while we complete our evidence gathering. What followed was the most comprehensive confession I'd ever witnessed in 37 years at sea. Romano didn't just admit to the crimes we'd already documented, he revealed the entire structure of Castellanos' network, including operations we hadn't even discovered yet. Ships operating in the Caribbean that used identical fraud techniques, a training facility in Panama where crew members were taught psychological manipulation tactics, a network of shell companies that laundered stolen money through legitimate business accounts across 15 countries. But the revelation that made my blood boil was learning about the retirement cruise scam specifically designed to target elderly passengers on their final vacation. These criminals had calculated that older victims were less likely to pursue legal action and more likely to blame themselves for financial losses. Inspector Webb, you have to understand, none of us wanted to participate in these activities. Castellanos had complete control over our employment, our references, our ability to work anywhere in the maritime industry. If we didn't cooperate... Captain, save your explanations for the federal prosecutors. Right now, I need you to help me protect the passengers and crew on this vessel while we complete our investigation. The next 6 hours transformed the Mediterranean Star from a floating criminal enterprise into what a cruise ship should actually be. Fraudulent charges were reversed, gambling operations were shut down and audited, safety protocols were implemented properly, and crew members were freed to do their jobs without fear of retaliation. But the most meaningful moment came when Elena brought me to meet Sofia Martinez, an 82-year-old grandmother from Madrid who'd been systematically cheated out of €4,000 through casino manipulation and hidden fees. "Senora Martinez, I'm Inspector Webb. I understand you've had some problems with charges on your account." Her eyes filled with tears as she clutched my hand. "Inspector, I saved for 3 years to take this cruise after my husband died. It was supposed to be my way of celebrating his memory, but they took everything. I don't even have money for souvenirs for my grandchildren." Within an hour, Sophia had received full restitution plus additional compensation for the emotional distress she'd endured. More importantly, she had her dignity restored and the knowledge that the people who'd victimized her would face justice. That evening, as we sailed into Rome's port for the final time under my temporary command, I received a call that would define the next phase of this war against maritime crime. "Inspector Webb, this is Director Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I wanted to personally thank you for the evidence you've provided. We've just arrested Victor Castellanos at his villa in Monaco. He was attempting to destroy financial records when our agents arrived." "Director Chen, what can you tell me about the scope of his network?" "Based on the evidence you and your team gathered, we've identified criminal operations on 47 vessels across 6 cruise lines. Financial losses to passengers exceed $800 million over the past 5 years. This is the largest maritime fraud case in FBI history." $800 million. I sat down heavily in my captain's chair, processing the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. Hundreds of thousands of passengers victimized, thousands of crew members forced into criminal complicity, an entire industry corrupted by systematic greed. "Director Chen, what happens to the passengers who've already been victimized? How do we make them whole again?" That's the best part, Inspector. Castellanos was so confident in his money laundering system that he kept detailed records of every fraudulent transaction. We've frozen accounts containing over $600 million in stolen funds. Passenger restitution will begin immediately. But the victory that meant the most to me came in a handwritten letter delivered to my cabin that evening. It was from Margaret Henderson, the elderly widow from Ohio, whose case had started my personal war against cruise ship corruption. "Dear Captain Webb, I wanted you to know that the money you recovered has allowed me to move back into my own apartment and regain my independence. But more than that, knowing that justice was served has given me back my faith in human decency. Thank you for proving that one person can still make a difference." 3 months later, I stood on the bridge of a completely different kind of vessel, a new generation cruise ship designed from the ground up with passenger protection and crew welfare as primary considerations. The Mediterranean Star had been seized by authorities and converted into a training facility where maritime professionals learned to identify and prevent the kind of criminal activities that had corrupted the industry for years. The joint task force Admiral Morrison had created was now a permanent international organization with the authority to investigate and prosecute maritime crimes across all jurisdictions. 47 corrupt vessels had been cleaned up or shut down. 234 individuals had been arrested and charged with crimes ranging from fraud to money laundering to conspiracy. But the statistic I was most proud of was the passenger satisfaction rating across the reformed cruise industry. 97%, proving that treating people with honesty and respect wasn't just morally right, it was also better business. That evening, as I prepared to transfer command to the ship's new captain, a young woman whose integrity had been tested and proven during our investigation, I reflected on how far we'd come since that first morning when I'd been banned from the oceanic paradise for standing up to corruption. The cruise industry would never be the same. Passengers now traveled with confidence, knowing that international law enforcement was actively protecting their interests. Crew members could do their jobs with integrity, knowing that criminal behavior would be prosecuted regardless of corporate pressure. And future generations of travelers would benefit from systems designed to serve rather than exploit them. As I walked down the gangway for the final time, I passed new passengers boarding for what would be their dream vacation, not because they'd been manipulated by marketing schemes, but because they were genuinely being offered the hospitality and safety they deserved. The war against maritime corruption had been won, but the victory belonged to everyone who'd refused to accept that being victimized was just the cost of taking a cruise. From Margaret Henderson's courage in sharing her story, to Elena Petrov's bravery in providing inside information, to the hundreds of passengers and crew members who'd testified despite intimidation and threats. Sometimes justice doesn't just knock on the door wearing steel-toed boots. Sometimes it shows up wearing a captain's uniform, backed by international law enforcement and armed with the determination to prove that no criminal enterprise is too big or too sophisticated to be held accountable for its crimes. The ocean was vast, but it wasn't big enough for people who thought they could prey on innocent travelers without consequences. And as long as there were criminals who believed they were untouchable, there would be people like me ready to prove them wrong. The next morning, I received one final call from Admiral Morrison. "Captain Webb, I hope you're ready for another assignment, because we've just received reports about systematic fraud in the Alaska cruise industry. Apparently, some people didn't get the message about what happens when you declare war on international maritime law enforcement." I smiled and reached for my captain's uniform. Some battles never end. They just move to new waters. And I couldn't wait to show the next group of criminals what happens when they mistake kindness for weakness and assume that victims have no champions willing to fight for justice. After all, the ocean was full of corrupt ships that needed new captains, and I was just getting started.